She handed me the gift box with a smile that should have been warm but felt rehearsed. Inside was a leather-bound photo album, every page chronicling our 5 years together, with a handwritten note on the last page that read, "To celebrate our anniversary next week. I've planned something special, just the two of us, the way it should be." I looked up at Elena, my wife of 5 years, expecting to see excitement in her eyes. Instead, I caught something else flickering there before she quickly looked away. A shadow of guilt that made my stomach tighten, though I couldn't explain why. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Thompson, and at 35 I thought I had mastered the art of reading people. As a senior fraud investigator for Pacific Trust Bank, I spent my days detecting deception, following paper trails, and uncovering lies that others thought were buried deep enough to never see daylight. Numbers don't lie, patterns reveal truth, and inconsistencies always tell a story. But somehow, I'd been living with the biggest fraud of all, and it was happening right under my own roof. Elena Martinez had been my wife for 5 years, together for 7. She was a marketing director at a boutique agency in downtown Seattle, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and command attention without trying. Raven black hair that caught the light just right, eyes the color of dark coffee, and a laugh that could make you forget whatever stress the day had thrown at you. When we first met at a friend's housewarming party, she was standing by the window overlooking Elliott Bay, wineglass in hand, telling a story that had 3 people hanging on every word. I was drawn to her immediately, not just because she was beautiful, but because she had this way of making ordinary moments feel extraordinary. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of weekend trips to Whidbey Island, long dinners at hidden restaurants in Capitol Hill, and late-night conversations that stretched until sunrise. Elena had this infectious energy, always planning the next adventure, the next experience that would create another perfect memory. She documented everything: photos, journal entries, ticket stubs from concerts, pressed flowers from hikes. She called it collecting moments, and I loved how she saw magic in the mundane. When I proposed to her on the observation deck of the Space Needle during a rare clear December evening, with the city lights spread out below us like scattered diamonds, she cried tears of joy that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine. The wedding was everything she had dreamed of, an intimate ceremony at a vineyard in Woodinville with 50 of our closest friends and family. Elena looked radiant in her vintage lace dress, and when she said her vows about loving me through all seasons of life, I believed every word with the certainty that only comes from being completely foolishly in love. We bought our house in Queen Anne 2 years after the wedding, a charming craftsman with a view of the Sound from the upstairs bedroom. Elena threw herself into making it a home, painting walls in warm earth tones, hanging art from local galleries, and creating a garden that bloomed in careful succession from spring through fall. Sunday mornings became our ritual, coffee on the back deck, Elena with her legs tucked under her reading design magazines while I worked through the Seattle Times sports section. Evenings were farmers market runs, cooking experiments that sometimes failed spectacularly, and Netflix binges where we'd debate the plot holes in whatever thriller we were watching. From the outside, we looked like the couple everyone wanted to be. Elena would post photos of our adventures on Instagram, always perfectly curated, always capturing that golden hour light that made everything look like a magazine spread. Friends would comment about how lucky we were, how perfect we seemed together, and for a long time, I believed it too. I thought we were building something solid, something that would last through whatever life threw at us. But perfection is often just good lighting and careful editing. Behind the camera, cracks had been forming that I was either too busy or too naive to notice. Elena had started working longer hours, claiming her agency had landed several major clients that required her personal attention. Weekend trips became less frequent, replaced by Elena's need to catch up on work or attend networking events that somehow never included me. She'd come home energized but distant, full of stories about new contacts and potential opportunities, but vague about the details when I asked follow-up questions. The photo album she'd given me sat on our coffee table for days after, a monument to what we used to be. I found myself flipping through it when Elena was upstairs taking her increasingly long phone calls, studying the images of our happier times like evidence in a case I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. There we were hiking Mount Pilchuck, Elena's face flushed with exertion and joy. There we were at Pike Place Market, both of us laughing at something the fishmonger had shouted. There we were on last year's anniversary trip to Victoria, Elena leaning against me on the ferry, eyes closed, looking completely content. But as I studied these frozen moments, I began to notice things that hadn't registered at the time. In the more recent photos, Elena's smiles seemed different, less natural, more performed. Her body language had shifted too, subtle things that my trained eye for deception should have caught sooner. She stood slightly apart from me, her shoulders angled away, her eyes often looking just past the camera rather than directly at me. The last photo in the album was from 3 months ago at her company's holiday party, and even though we were both smiling, there was something hollow in her expression, like she was already somewhere else in her mind. The special anniversary surprise Elena had mentioned turned out to be a long weekend at the lodge at Pebble Beach, a place we'd talked about visiting since our honeymoon planning days. She'd booked us a suite overlooking the 18th hole, dinner reservations at Nobu, and spa treatments at the resort. It should have been romantic, a chance to reconnect and remember why we'd fallen in love in the first place. Instead, it felt like Elena was going through the motions, checking boxes on some invisible list of what an anniversary celebration should include. During our 3 days there, Elena was present but not present. She took photos of everything: the sunset from our balcony, the perfectly plated dishes at dinner, the champagne flutes raised in a toast to our marriage. But when I tried to engage her in real conversation, to talk about our future or revisit memories from our early days together, she'd deflect with comments about the beautiful weather or how lucky we were to be there. She spent more time looking at her phone than looking at me, claiming she was just checking work emails, but I caught glimpses of text conversations that definitely weren't about marketing campaigns. On our last night at Pebble Beach, Elena suggested we take a walk along the beach after dinner. The Pacific stretched out endlessly before us, waves crashing against the rocks in a rhythm that should have been soothing. Instead, it felt like a soundtrack to something ending. Elena walked beside me in silence for a long time before finally speaking, her voice barely audible over the ocean's roar. "Marcus, I need to tell you something," she said, stopping suddenly and turning to face me. The moonlight caught her face, highlighting the tension in her features. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about us, about what we want from life." My investigator instincts kicked in immediately. This was the tone people used when they were about to confess something significant. I kept my expression neutral, waiting for her to continue, even though my heart was already starting to race. "I love you," Elena continued, but the words felt heavy, loaded with an unspoken "but." "I love the life we've built together, but I feel like we've grown into different people. I feel like I've lost myself somewhere along the way." It was a carefully constructed speech, the kind someone rehearses in their head multiple times before delivering. Elena was good at presentations, it was part of her job, and this felt like a presentation too. Professional, polished and designed to minimize pushback. "What are you saying, Elena?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "I'm saying I need some space to figure things out," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "Not a separation, just some time to think, maybe a few weeks apart." The timing struck me as odd. Why bring this up during our anniversary celebration, in one of the most romantic settings imaginable? Why wait until we were 3 days into what was supposed to be a reconnection to drop this revelation? As a fraud investigator, I'd learned that timing often reveals more about someone's true intentions than their words do. We flew back to Seattle the next morning in near silence. Elena sat by the window, ostensibly reading a magazine, but I noticed she never turned the pages. I stared out at the clouds below us, my mind racing through the patterns and inconsistencies that I'd been unconsciously cataloging for months. Elena's late nights at work that never seemed to generate any tangible results.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Her sudden interest in yoga classes that she never wanted to talk about afterward, the way she'd started dressing differently, more carefully, like she was always heading somewhere important after work. Back home, Elena threw herself into planning what she called her thinking retreat. She'd found a bed and breakfast in the San Juan Islands, she explained, a place where she could have some quiet time to sort through her feelings. She'd be gone for 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on how long it took to gain clarity about our marriage. The whole thing felt scripted, too organized for someone who was supposedly having an emotional crisis. The night before Elena left for her retreat, I lay in bed listening to her pack in the next room. She was being methodical about it, not the frantic packing of someone making an impulsive decision, but the careful preparation of someone executing a plan. Through the thin walls I could hear her on the phone, voice lowered to almost a whisper. I caught fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. "I know it's been hard to wait," Elena was saying, Yes, I told him I need space. No, he doesn't suspect anything. 2 weeks should be enough time to figure out if this is what I really want. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a retreat for self-discovery, this was a rendezvous. Elena wasn't going to the San Juan Islands to think about our marriage. She was going there to be with someone else. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, my investigator mind working overtime to process this new information. Every suspicious behavior from the past few months took on new meaning. The late-night phone calls weren't work emergencies. The networking events weren't about building her career. The yoga classes were probably covers for meeting someone else. Elena hadn't lost herself in our marriage. She'd found someone else and was trying to figure out how to leave me for them. The next morning, Elena kissed me goodbye with lips that felt cold despite the warm sentiment behind her words. "I love you, Marcus," she said, her hand lingering on my cheek. "I just need to figure out if love is enough." It was a beautifully crafted lie, designed to make me feel like I was the problem, like our marriage was failing because I wasn't enough for her. But I'd heard enough confessions to recognize manipulation when it was directed at me. Elena wasn't questioning whether love was enough. She was stalling for time while she figured out how to blow up our life without looking like the villain. I watched from our bedroom window as Elena loaded her suitcase into her silver Audi and drove away. She didn't look back at the house, didn't wave, just pulled out of the driveway and disappeared around the corner like she was heading to any ordinary day at work. But I knew this wasn't ordinary. This was the beginning of the end of everything we'd built together. After Elena's car disappeared, I sat in our empty house and did what I do best. I started investigating. Not because I wanted to prove Elena was cheating, I already knew that much, but because I needed to understand the scope of her deception. How long had this been going on? Who was she with? And most importantly, what was she planning to do about our marriage? When she came back from her fake retreat, I started with her laptop, which she'd left behind, claiming she wanted to disconnect completely from work and social media. Elena had always been careless with passwords, using variations of our anniversary date and our dog's name for everything. Within minutes I was scrolling through her email history, looking for patterns and anomalies that would tell me the real story. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Elena hadn't just been having an affair, she'd been planning her exit strategy for months. There were emails to divorce attorneys, requesting consultations about asset division and spousal support. There were real estate searches for apartments in neighborhoods across the city, all saved under a folder labeled Fresh Start. There were even emails to a moving company, asking about storage options and cross-country relocations. But the most damning evidence was in her deleted items folder, which she'd apparently forgotten to empty. Email after email with someone named David Chen, her ex-boyfriend from college. The same David Chen she'd dated for 3 years before we met, the one she described as her first real love, the one who'd broken her heart when he moved to San Francisco for a tech job right after graduation. The email thread between Elena and David went back 8 months, starting with what looked like an innocent reconnection after David had found her on LinkedIn. He was back in Seattle, working for a startup, and had reached out to catch up over coffee. Elena had mentioned the coffee meeting to me at the time, describing it as a friendly catch-up with an old friend. She'd even shown me a photo David had posted on Instagram of him and his golden retriever on a hiking trail, laughing about how he'd finally gotten the dog he'd always talked about wanting. But the emails told a different story. What started as casual reminiscing about college days had quickly escalated into something much more intimate. David wrote about how seeing Elena again had reminded him of what he'd given up when he left Seattle, how he'd spent years comparing every woman he dated to her. Elena responded with confessions about feeling trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt empty inside. By month 3, they were meeting regularly, always at places where they were unlikely to be seen by anyone who knew me. Coffee shops in Fremont, late dinners in Ballard, weekend hikes on trails Elena had never mentioned to me. By month 6, the emails had become love letters, filled with plans for a future together and regrets about the time they'd lost. The most recent email was from David, sent just 2 days before Elena's departure for her supposed retreat. "I can't wait to have 2 weeks with you at the cabin," he'd written. "I know this is complicated, but I truly believe we're meant to be together. When you get back to Seattle, we'll figure out the next steps. I love you, El. I never stopped loving you." Elena's response was brief but definitive. "I love you too, David. I'm ready to start over with you. I just need to find the right way to end things with Mark. He's a good man, and I don't want to hurt him more than necessary. The casual way she discussed destroying our marriage, like it was a business decision requiring careful planning, rather than the end of a life we'd built together, hit me harder than the affair itself. Elena wasn't torn between two loves, she'd already made her choice. She was just trying to engineer a clean exit that would allow her to maintain her image as a good person who'd been forced to make a difficult decision. I printed out the entire email thread, nearly 40 pages of evidence that laid out Elena's months-long deception in excruciating detail. Then I dug deeper, cross-referencing the dates of their meetings with Elena's calendar and credit card statements. Every girls' night out that had kept her out past midnight corresponded with a dinner charge at one of their secret restaurants. Every yoga class she'd attended matched up with parking charges near David's apartment building in Capitol Hill. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd been living a double life with the skill of a professional con artist. Elena had been methodical in her deception, creating elaborate covers for every meeting, building a network of alibis that would have fooled anyone who wasn't trained to spot patterns of fraud. She'd even gone so far as to create fake social media posts checking in at locations where she claimed to be while actually spending time with David. But the most painful discovery was in Elena's journal, which she kept hidden in a shoebox in our bedroom closet. The last entry, dated just 1 week before her departure, laid out her true feelings with brutal honesty. "I feel terrible about lying to Marcus," she'd written, "but I can't help how I feel about David. Marcus will never understand that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome growing apart. He's too literal, too focused on facts and evidence to understand that hearts change. When I come back from the cabin, I'll have to tell him about David. It will hurt him, but staying in a marriage where I'm not happy would hurt him more in the long run." The hypocrisy was staggering. Elena was rewriting history to cast herself as the hero of her own story, someone making a noble sacrifice rather than someone who'd been cheating on her husband for 8 months. She was preparing to blame our marriage's failure on incompatibility and emotional distance, conveniently leaving out the part where she'd been having an affair with her ex-boyfriend. But as painful as these discoveries were, they also gave me something valuable: information. As a fraud investigator, I knew that information was power, and I now had a complete picture of Elena's deception. I knew where she was going, who she was with, and what she was planning to do when she returned. The question was what I was going to do with that knowledge. I could confront her immediately, call her at the cabin and demand an explanation. I could pack up her belongings and change the locks, making it clear that she'd made her choice and would have to live with the consequences. I could even hire a private investigator to document her affair, building an airtight case for a divorce that would protect my assets and reputation. But none of those options felt right. They were too reactive, too emotional, too much like the behavior of a man who'd been blindsided by his wife's betrayal. Instead, I decided to do what I did best. I would investigate further, gather more evidence, and wait for the perfect moment to reveal what I knew. Elena thought she was controlling the narrative of our marriage's end. She was about to learn that the man she'd been deceiving for months was far more dangerous than she'd realized. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of heading to the bank, I drove to Anacortes to catch the ferry to the San Juan Islands. If Elena and David thought they were going to spend 2 weeks playing house in romantic isolation, they were about to discover they had an audience. I'd done my research the night before, using Elena's email confirmations to identify exactly where they were staying. The Whale Song Cabin was a luxury rental property on the west side of San Juan Island, perched on a bluff overlooking Harrow Strait. The listing boasted about its privacy and seclusion, perfect for couples seeking a romantic getaway away from the distractions of everyday life. Elena had paid for it using our joint credit card, apparently confident that I wouldn't bother checking our statements while she was gone. The ferry ride to Friday Harbor gave me time to plan my approach. I wasn't going to storm the cabin and confront them directly. That would only give Elena ammunition to paint me as the jealous, controlling husband she was probably already describing to David. Instead, I was going to document their affair thoroughly, building a case that would make it impossible for Elena to spin her betrayal as anything other than what it was. I'd brought my professional camera, the one I used for photographing evidence in fraud cases, along with a telephoto lens that could capture clear images from a considerable distance. I'd also packed camping gear and enough supplies to last several days. If Elena wanted to have her romantic getaway with David, I was going to make sure every moment was preserved for posterity. The cabin was exactly as advertised, an upscale log structure with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water and a hot tub on the deck that would have been perfect for a legitimate anniversary celebration. Elena's silver Audi was parked in the driveway next to a black Tesla that undoubtedly belonged to David. Even their choice of cars seemed designed to mock me, his sleek electric vehicle making my practical Honda Civic look mundane by comparison. I set up my surveillance position in a grove of Douglas firs about 200 yards from the cabin, close enough to capture clear images but far enough away to remain undetected. Through my telephoto lens I could see into the cabin's main living area, where Elena and David were sitting by the fireplace, wine glasses in hand, looking like they were posing for a romantic retreat magazine. Elena looked different than she had when she left Seattle just 2 days earlier. Relaxed, animated, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in months. She was wearing a red dress I'd never seen before, something she must have bought specifically for this trip. Her hair was styled differently too, loose and natural instead of the professional updos she'd favored lately. She looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with 7 years earlier, but she was sharing that version of herself with someone else. David was exactly what I'd expected from Elena's college stories and his social media photos. Tall, athletic, with the kind of effortless style that comes from having enough money to buy expensive clothes but enough confidence to wear them casually. He had his arm around Elena in a way that spoke of familiarity and possession, like he'd never stopped thinking of her as his. I spent the next 6 hours documenting their activities, capturing images of them cooking dinner together, sharing intimate conversations on the deck, and eventually moving to the bedroom as the sun set over the strait. Every photo was time-stamped and geotagged, creating an irrefutable record of Elena's affair during what was supposed to be her marriage-saving retreat. But as the night wore on, I realized that simply documenting their affair wasn't enough. Elena had already decided to leave our marriage. Having proof of her infidelity might help in divorce proceedings, but it wouldn't change the fundamental fact that she'd chosen David over me. If I wanted real justice, if I wanted Elena to face genuine consequences for her deception, I needed to think bigger. That's when I remembered something David had mentioned in one of his emails to Elena. He was in the middle of a crucial funding round for his startup, trying to raise $15 million from venture capital firms that valued character and integrity as much as business acumen. His company's success depended not just on his technical skills but on his reputation as someone investors could trust with their money. I also remembered Elena's position at her marketing agency, where she'd recently been promoted to director and was being considered for a partnership track. Her career was built on her ability to manage high-profile clients and maintain the agency's reputation for ethical business practices. Both Elena and David were successful professionals whose careers depended on their personal integrity. Sitting in the forest watching them celebrate their deception, I began to formulate a plan that would give them exactly what they wanted: a future together, but strip away everything else they valued in the process. Elena wanted to rewrite the story of our marriage to make herself the victim of an incompatible relationship. David wanted to reclaim the woman he'd let slip away in college. They were both about to learn that getting what you want and keeping what you need are two very different things. I spent 3 more days documenting their every move, building a comprehensive record of their affair that would be impossible to deny or explain away. I captured images of them hiking together on trails they'd told no one else about, sharing romantic dinners on the cabin's deck, and lounging in the hot tub under a canopy of stars. I recorded the license plates of both their cars and noted the exact times of their arrivals and departures for every activity. Most importantly, I documented their carelessness. Despite being in what they thought was complete privacy, both Elena and David continued to use their phones constantly, posting innocuous updates to social media that I would later be able to cross-reference with my photographic evidence. Elena posted a sunset photo from the cabin's deck with a caption about finding peace in solitude, while David shared an image of his morning coffee with a comment about taking time to appreciate life's simple pleasures. Neither of them realized that their supposedly private getaway was being chronicled by someone with the skills and equipment to build a case that would hold up in any court of law or public opinion. They thought they were writing a love story. I was documenting a crime. On the 4th day, I watched as they packed their cars and prepared to return to Seattle. Elena looked radiant, transformed by her time with David in a way that would have been heartbreaking if I hadn't already moved past heartbreak into something colder and more focused. David kept touching her face and hands like he couldn't quite believe she was real, and Elena responded with the kind of genuine affection she hadn't shown me in months. They stood by their cars for a long time, reluctant to end their romantic interlude and return to the complicated reality of Elena's marriage. I heard fragments of their conversation carried on the wind, plans for future meetings and discussions about timing. Elena promised to end things with me as quickly and cleanly as possible, while David assured her that he would be patient but couldn't wait to start their real life together. As they drove away in opposite directions, Elena heading to the ferry and David taking the scenic route around the island, I remained in my hiding place for another hour, reviewing the hundreds of photos and video clips I'd captured. The evidence was overwhelming, artistic in its completeness, devastating in its clarity. Elena thought she was returning to Seattle to execute her carefully planned exit strategy. She had no idea that her husband had spent the last 4 days building a case that would demolish not just her marriage but everything else she'd worked to build. David believed he was heading back to his startup and his funding meetings with the love of his life finally within reach. He didn't know that his romantic reunion was about to become the most expensive mistake of his professional life. I packed up my surveillance equipment and drove back to Anacortes, my mind already working through the next phase of my plan. Elena would be home that evening, probably with a story about how her time alone had given her clarity about our relationship. She'd ask for a separation, maybe even suggest couples therapy as a way to ease me into accepting the inevitable end of our marriage. But Elena had made one crucial error in her planning. She'd chosen to betray a man whose entire professional life was built around uncovering deception and following evidence to its logical conclusion. She'd tried to con a fraud investigator, and now she was about to discover that some people are far more dangerous when they're armed with the truth than when they're blinded by love. The real confrontation was still days away, but as I drove through the San Juan Island's winding roads toward home, I felt a calm satisfaction that came from knowing exactly how this story was going to end. Elena wanted to control the narrative of our marriage's destruction. Instead, she was about to become the star of a very different kind of story, one where actions had consequences and deception came with a price that would be paid in full. Elena arrived home that Thursday evening with the glow of someone who had just spent 2 weeks discovering herself. She looked refreshed, rejuvenated, like she had shed some invisible burden during her time away. Her skin had a healthy tan that definitely hadn't come from Seattle's perpetual overcast, and her hair had natural highlights that spoke of days spent in actual sunshine. She hugged me at the door with an enthusiasm that felt performative, holding on just long enough to seem genuine but not long enough to feel real. "I missed you," she said, pulling back to look at me with eyes that sparkled with what I now recognized as the afterglow of her affair. The time away was exactly what I needed. I feel like I can see everything so much more clearly now. I helped her carry her luggage upstairs, noting that she had packed more clothes than she'd taken with her. Either she'd done some serious shopping during her retreat, or David had been generous with gifts. The suitcase felt heavier too, weighted down with souvenirs from a trip that was supposed to have been about solitary reflection. Elena unpacked with the careful attention of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She showed me a few innocuous items: a scented candle from a local shop, a small piece of driftwood she claimed to have found during a walk on the beach, a journal she said had helped her process her thoughts. Each item came with a story that sounded plausible but felt hollow, like props in a play rather than genuine mementos. "I did a lot of thinking while I was gone," Elena said as she hung up clothes that looked suspiciously unwrinkled for someone who had been camping out in rustic accommodations. "About us, about what we both want from life, about whether we're still the same people who fell in love 7 years ago." The speech she delivered over dinner that night was masterful in its construction. Elena spoke about growing apart naturally, about recognizing that love sometimes isn't enough to overcome fundamental incompatibilities. She talked about feeling like she had lost herself in our marriage, not because I was controlling, but because she had somehow forgotten who she was when she wasn't part of a couple. She was careful to make it sound like a mutual problem, something we had both contributed to through neglect rather than malice. Elena painted a picture of two good people who had simply outgrown their relationship, who needed to have the courage to admit that staying together would only hurt them both in the long run. "I think we should separate," Elena finally said, reaching across the table to take my hand with fingers that had been entwined with another man's just hours earlier. "Not because I don't love you, but because I love you enough to be honest about what's not working between us." I listened to her entire presentation without interruption, occasionally nodding as if I were processing this information for the first time. Elena's eyes searched my face for signs of shock, anger, or desperation, but I kept my expression neutral, thoughtful, like a man trying to absorb the implications of his wife's revelation. "How long have you been feeling this way?" I asked, though I already knew the answer down to the exact month. Elena looked relieved that I wasn't arguing or trying to talk her out of her decision. It's been building for a while, she admitted. Maybe 6 months, maybe longer. I kept hoping the feelings would pass, that we'd find our way back to each other, but the time away helped me realize that some things can't be fixed just because we want them to be. It was a beautiful lie, perfectly crafted to absolve her of guilt while making me feel like I had been part of the problem. Elena had always been skilled at managing narratives. It was part of what made her good at her job, but she had never used those skills on me so directly before. "What are you thinking?" she asked when I remained silent for several long moments. "I'm thinking you're right," I said finally, watching the relief flood across her features. "I felt us drifting apart too. Maybe separation is the healthiest thing for both of us." Elena's smile was radiant, the expression of someone who had just been handed exactly what she wanted without having to fight for it. She had expected resistance, arguments, maybe even tears. Instead, she was getting a mature, understanding husband who was willing to step aside gracefully for her happiness. "Really?" she said, unable to hide her surprise. "You're not angry." "Why would I be angry?" I replied. "You're being honest about your feelings. That takes courage. I'd rather have a wife who tells me the truth than one who stays out of obligation." Elena actually teared up at this, moved by what she interpreted as my selfless love for her. In her mind, I was proving that I was indeed the good man she had described to David, someone who deserved better than a wife who had fallen out of love with him. We spent the rest of the evening discussing practical matters with the civility of two business partners dissolving a successful venture. Elena suggested she could stay with her sister for a few weeks while we figured out the logistics of dividing our assets and determining who would keep the house. She was eager to move quickly, to avoid the messiness that often accompanied marital breakups. "I want this to be as clean as possible," Elena said. "We've had good years together, Marcus. I don't want to end things with lawyers and arguments and hurt feelings." I agreed wholeheartedly. Clean was exactly what I wanted too, though probably not in the way Elena imagined. Over the next few days, Elena threw herself into the logistics of our separation with the same organizational skills she brought to her marketing campaigns. She researched divorce mediators, compiled lists of shared assets, and even drafted a preliminary agreement about how we might divide our belongings. She was treating our marriage's end like a project that needed to be managed efficiently and professionally. What Elena didn't realize was that I was conducting my own research. While she made phone calls to attorneys and apartment hunting websites, I was building a comprehensive dossier of her affair that would make her careful planning irrelevant. I had printed out every email between her and David, organized them chronologically, and cross-referenced them with credit card statements and calendar entries. I had the photos from the cabin professionally printed and arranged them in a timeline that told the complete story of their romantic getaway. But the evidence of Elena's affair was just the foundation of what I was building. The real power lay in understanding the consequences that David and Elena would face when their relationship became public knowledge. David's startup was in the middle of a crucial funding round, courting investors who valued character as much as innovation. Elena's marketing agency prided itself on ethical business practices and maintained strict policies about personal conduct that could reflect negatively on the company. I spent hours researching both of their professional situations, understanding exactly how much damage public knowledge of their affair could cause to their careers. David's company had recently signed a major client, a family-owned business that specifically chose vendors based on their commitment to traditional values. Elena's agency represented several high-profile clients in the wedding industry, companies that depended on trust and emotional authenticity to sell their services. The more I learned about their professional vulnerabilities, the more I understood that Elena and David had built their careers on foundations that could be demolished by the right information delivered to the right people at the right time. They had thought they were being clever by conducting their affair discreetly, but they had actually created a situation where discovery would be catastrophic. Elena moved out the following weekend, packing her belongings with the efficiency of someone who had been mentally preparing for this moment for months. She took only what was clearly hers, leaving behind the artwork we had chosen together, the furniture we had bought as a couple, even the coffee machine she had picked up and used every morning for 3 years. "I want you to keep the house," she said as she loaded the last box into her car. "You've always loved this place more than I have, and you can afford the mortgage on your own." It was a generous gesture, designed to reinforce the narrative that this was a mutual decision made by two reasonable adults. Elena was being the considerate ex-wife, leaving me with the home we had shared while asking for nothing more than her personal belongings and half of our savings account. "Are you sure?" I asked. "This place has a lot of equity. You're entitled to half of everything." Elena waved off my concern with the magnanimity of someone who believed she was trading up to a better life. "I want to start fresh," she said. "New apartment, new routines, new everything. Besides, you put more money into the down payment than I did. It's only fair." I watched Elena drive away from our house for what she believed was the last time, her car loaded with the possessions that represented 5 years of marriage reduced to what could fit in a compact sedan. She looked happy, liberated, ready to begin the next chapter of her life with David. She had no idea that I was about to write that chapter for her. The day after Elena moved out, I called in another sick day and drove to downtown Seattle. My first stop was David's office building, a gleaming tower in South Lake Union that housed dozens of tech startups and venture capital firms. I spent an hour in the lobby coffee shop, observing the building's traffic patterns and noting the security measures in place. David's company, Nexus Analytics, occupied the 15th floor of the building. According to their website, they specialized in data mining software for retail companies, helping businesses understand consumer behavior patterns to optimize their marketing strategies. It was exactly the kind of business that depended on trust and reliability, where clients needed to believe that their data would be handled with complete discretion and professionalism. I took the elevator to the 15th floor and walked through the open office space, pretending to be a lost visitor looking for another company. David's office was exactly what I expected, a glass-walled space with minimalist furniture and a view of Elliott Bay. He was in a meeting with 3 people in expensive suits, probably the investors he had mentioned in his emails to Elena. David looked confident and comfortable as he presented his company's growth projections to the potential funders. He gestured animatedly at charts and graphs, clearly in his element as he explained how Nexus Analytics was poised to revolutionize retail data analysis. The investors nodded approvingly, taking notes and asking detailed questions about market penetration and scalability. I watched the meeting for several minutes, studying David's body language and presentation style. He was polished, articulate, exactly the kind of entrepreneur that venture capitalists love to back. But he was also someone whose success depended entirely on his reputation for integrity and sound judgment. My next stop was Elena's marketing agency, a boutique firm called Meridian Creative that occupied a converted warehouse in the Fremont neighborhood. The agency specialized in lifestyle marketing, working with high-end wedding vendors, luxury travel companies, and artisanal food producers. Their client list read like a directory of Seattle's most exclusive service providers. Elena's office was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the agency's open workspace where young creatives bent over laptops and mood boards. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see her at her desk, animated and energetic as she worked on what appeared to be a presentation for a client meeting. Like David, Elena looked completely at ease in her professional environment. She had built a reputation as someone who understood the emotional complexities of marketing luxury experiences, someone clients trusted to represent their brands with sophistication and authenticity. But that reputation would become a liability if her personal life contradicted the values she claimed to represent professionally. I spent the rest of the day researching the specific clients that both David and Elena served, understanding exactly how their affair could be weaponized to maximum effect. David's biggest potential investor was a family foundation run by a prominent local businessman, known for his conservative values and philanthropy supporting traditional marriage initiatives. Elena's largest client was a wedding planning company that marketed itself as specializing in authentic love stories, and had recently launched a campaign celebrating couples who had overcome adversity to find lasting happiness. The irony was perfect. Both David and Elena had built their professional success on foundations that would crumble if their affair became public knowledge. They thought they were being strategic by keeping their relationship secret until Elena's divorce was finalized, but they had actually created a situation where discovery would be professionally devastating. That evening I sat in my empty house and began drafting the documents that would destroy both of their careers. The first was a detailed timeline of Elena and David's affair, complete with photographs, email transcripts and financial records. The second was a comprehensive analysis of how their relationship violated the ethical standards that both of their companies publicly embraced. But the most important document was a letter I planned to send to specific individuals who had the power to turn Elena and David's romantic reunion into a professional catastrophe. David's primary investor, Elena's biggest client, the board of directors at David's building management company, the ethics committee at Elena's industry association. Each recipient would receive a customized version of the story, tailored to highlight the aspects of the affair that would be most damaging to David and Elena's professional standing. I wasn't planning to send these letters immediately. Elena and David deserved a chance to enjoy their reunion before they discovered the price of their happiness. But I wanted everything prepared, ready to deploy at the moment of maximum impact. Elena called me later that week to check in and see how I was adjusting to living alone. Her voice was bright and cheerful, the tone of someone whose life was finally falling into place exactly as she had planned. "I wanted you to know that I've started seeing someone," she said, delivering the news with carefully practiced casualness. "I know it might seem fast, but he's actually someone I dated in college before we met. We reconnected recently, and I realize now that we never really got over each other." It was a masterful way of introducing David into our post-marriage narrative. Elena was framing their relationship as a reunion with a lost love rather than an affair that had destroyed our marriage. She was rewriting history to make herself the heroine of a romantic second-chance story, rather than the villain of an adultery tale. "I hope you can be happy for me," Elena continued. "I know this is complicated, but I want you to know that meeting David again helped me realize what was missing in our marriage. It wasn't anyone's fault, we just weren't meant to be together forever." I told Elena that I was glad she had found someone who made her happy, that I wanted nothing more than for her to be fulfilled and loved. She was clearly relieved by my mature response, probably sharing the details of our conversation with David as proof that I was handling our separation with grace and dignity. What Elena didn't know was that every word of our conversation was being recorded, not because I enjoyed listening to her lies, but because I wanted a complete record of how she planned to justify her actions to our mutual friends and family. Elena was already working to control the narrative of our marriage's end, and I wanted to document exactly how she planned to rewrite our history. Over the next few weeks, Elena and David became increasingly careless about their relationship. They started appearing together at public events, posting photos on social media that showed them hiking the same trails and dining at the same restaurants. They thought enough time had passed since Elena's separation to make their relationship seem organic rather than pre-planned. David began showing up at Elena's agency events, introduced as her new boyfriend to colleagues who had no idea that their relationship predated Elena's separation. Elena started attending David's business functions, playing the role of the supportive partner who was helping him navigate the stressful world of startup funding. They were building a public narrative of their relationship that erased the months of deception that had preceded Elena's separation. In their version of events, they were two college sweethearts who had found each other again after years apart, reconnecting just as Elena was realizing that her marriage had run its course. It was a beautiful story, perfectly crafted to avoid any suggestion of impropriety or betrayal. Elena and David had convinced themselves that their careful timing had erased the moral complications of their affair. They believed they had successfully managed the transition from Elena's marriage to their reunion without anyone getting hurt unnecessarily. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that I was the kind of man who would accept their version of events and move on quietly with my life. They thought they were dealing with a wounded husband who would retreat into his work and eventually find someone else to love. Instead, they were dealing with a fraud investigator who had spent weeks building an airtight case against them, someone who understood exactly how to destroy reputations and careers with surgical precision. Elena and David thought they had gotten away with their deception. They were about to learn that some victories come with delayed but devastating consequences. I waited until David's funding round reached its final stage, until Elena's agency was about to announce a major new client acquisition, until both of them were at the peak of their professional confidence. They needed to believe they had won, that their careful planning had paid off, that they were finally free to enjoy the life they had built on the foundation of their lies. The timing was crucial. David's investors were scheduled to finalize their $15 million investment on a Tuesday morning. Elena's new client was planning to announce their partnership with Meridian Creative the following day. Both events represented the culmination of months of work, professional victories that would cement David and Elena's reputations as rising stars in their respective fields. On Monday evening, I began sending the emails that would shatter both of their careers. Each message was carefully crafted, professional in tone but devastating in content. I attached photographs, email transcripts, and financial records that told the complete story of David and Elena's affair with documentary precision. The first email went to David's primary investor, the family foundation that had been impressed by his character as much as his business acumen. The message was brief and direct, explaining that I felt obligated to share information about David's personal conduct that might be relevant to their investment decision. The second email went to Elena's biggest client, the wedding planning company that marketed itself on authentic love stories. I explained that I thought they should be aware of their marketing director's recent personal history before finalizing their business partnership. But the most damaging emails went to David's business partners and Elena's colleagues, people who had been impressed by their apparent integrity and trustworthiness. These messages included the complete timeline of their affair, showing exactly how long they had been deceiving everyone around them while presenting themselves as ethical professionals. I sent each email from an anonymous account, but I included enough verifiable information to make the allegations impossible to dismiss as the rantings of a bitter ex-husband. Every photograph was timestamped and geotagged. Every email was authenticated with metadata. Every financial record was cross-referenced with public databases. By Tuesday morning, David and Elena's carefully constructed professional reputations would begin crumbling with the efficiency of a controlled demolition. They had spent months planning their romantic reunion. I had spent weeks planning their professional destruction. The first sign that my plan was working came Tuesday morning when Elena called me in tears. Her voice was shaking with a combination of rage and panic that I had never heard before. "Marcus, what did you do?" she demanded, her composure completely shattered. "Someone sent information about David and me to my clients. Photos, emails, everything. My boss wants to see me in his office in an hour and I think I'm going to be fired." I expressed appropriate shock and concern, asking Elena to explain what kind of information had been shared and whether she had any idea who might have sent it. She was too distraught to think clearly, pouring out details about the evidence that had been shared with her employer while trying to convince me that she was the victim of some malicious attack. "Whoever did this has been watching us, Marcus," Elena said through tears. "They have photos of David and me at places we never told anyone about. They know things about our relationship that only we knew. Someone has been stalking us." The paranoia in Elena's voice was deeply satisfying. She had spent months believing she was in complete control of her narrative, carefully managing every detail of her affair to avoid consequences. Now she was discovering that someone had been documenting her deception with the same methodical precision she had used to plan it. David called me an hour later, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. His investors had withdrawn their offer, citing concerns about his judgment and character. The family foundation that had been prepared to fund his company had released a statement explaining that they could not support entrepreneurs whose personal conduct contradicted their organization's values. "I know it was you," David said, his professional polish completely gone. "Elena might buy your innocent act, but I know exactly what kind of man you are. You've destroyed my company out of spite." I maintained my bewildered tone, suggesting that David was probably dealing with industrial espionage or a competitor who was trying to sabotage his business. But David wasn't buying my performance. He had enough experience in the business world to recognize a targeted attack when he saw one. "You think you've won," David continued, "but all you've done is prove that Elena was right to leave you. What kind of man destroys people's careers over a failed marriage?" The conversation ended with David threatening to pursue legal action against me for harassment and defamation, but we both knew that any legal investigation would only provide more opportunities to document his affair with Elena, creating additional evidence that would further damage both of their reputations. By the end of the week, the professional consequences of Elena and David's affair had spread through Seattle's interconnected business community like wildfire. Elena had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation at her agency. David's company had lost not only their primary investor but two major clients who had learned about his personal conduct through their professional networks. The wedding planning company that had been Elena's biggest client released a public statement distancing themselves from Meridian Creative, explaining that they could no longer work with an agency whose leadership didn't reflect their commitment to authentic relationships and family values. David's retail clients began asking pointed questions about data security and whether their sensitive information was being handled by someone they could trust. Elena's separation from me, which she had managed so carefully to seem mutual and amicable, was suddenly being re-examined by everyone who knew us. People started connecting the timeline of our marriage's end with the beginning of her relationship with David, realizing that the romantic reunion story they had been told was actually a cover for a months-long affair. The social consequences were just as devastating as the professional ones. Elena and David found themselves excluded from the professional and social circles they had worked years to join. Former friends stopped returning their calls. Business associates began treating them with the polite coldness reserved for people whose reputations had been permanently damaged. Elena moved in with David after losing her apartment lease, but their romantic reunion was now overshadowed by the wreckage of both their careers. They had gotten exactly what they wanted, a chance to be together without the complications of Elena's marriage. But the price had been everything else they valued. The most painful consequence for Elena came from her own family. Her parents, who had always been proud of her professional success and had welcomed me as a son-in-law, were horrified to learn the true circumstances of our marriage's end. Elena's sister, who had supported her during the separation, felt betrayed when she realized she had been used as cover for Elena's affair. Elena called me one final time, her voice hollow with the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching your entire life collapse in real time. She was no longer angry or accusatory, just tired and broken. "I know you did this," she said quietly. "I don't know how, but I know it was you. I guess I deserve it." It was the first honest thing Elena had said to me in months. She had finally stopped trying to manage the narrative and was simply acknowledging the reality of her situation. She had betrayed our marriage for a chance at happiness with David, and I had made sure that betrayal cost her everything else she had worked to build. "I loved you, Marcus," Elena continued. "Maybe not the way you needed me to, but I did love you. I never wanted to hurt you this much." I told Elena that I had loved her too, which was true, and that I hoped she and David would find a way to rebuild their lives together, which was less true. But the conversation felt like a genuine ending to our relationship, a moment of honesty that cut through all the careful lies and strategic omissions that had defined our final months together. Elena and David did eventually leave Seattle, relocating to Portland, where they hoped to start over in a city where their reputations hadn't been destroyed. David found work at a smaller tech company at a fraction of his previous salary, while Elena took a junior position at a marketing firm that specialized in agricultural products rather than luxury services. They got married in a small ceremony attended only by David's parents and Elena's sister, a far cry from the elaborate celebration Elena had once planned for her second chance at love. The wedding photos they posted on social media showed two people who looked older and more worn than their years, survivors of a scandal that had taught them the true cost of getting what you want through deception. 6 months after Elena and David fled to Portland, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Jennifer Walsh, Elena's former colleague from Meridian Creative, stood in my doorway looking nervous but determined. She had been one of the few people at the agency who knew about Elena's affair, though she claimed she only learned about it after everything had already unraveled. "I thought you should know," Jennifer said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Elena's been reaching out to some of her old contacts here in Seattle. She's trying to rebuild her reputation, claiming that what happened was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a vindictive ex-husband." Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of messages Elena had been sending through LinkedIn and Instagram. In them, Elena portrayed herself as the victim of a smear campaign, someone whose personal life had been weaponized by a controlling man who couldn't accept that their marriage had ended naturally. "She's telling people that you hired a private investigator to stalk her," Jennifer continued, "that you fabricated evidence and manipulated the timeline to make her look bad. She's even suggesting that some of the photos were doctored." I studied the messages, noting Elena's careful language and strategic omissions. She wasn't denying the affair outright, but she was reframing it as a relationship that began after our separation, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Elena was attempting to rehabilitate her image by casting me as an obsessive ex-husband who had destroyed innocent people out of spite. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Jennifer. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Because I was there when the evidence came to light. I saw the emails, the photos, the credit card statements. Everything was time-stamped and verified. Elena is lying about what happened, and I'm worried that if she keeps spreading this story, people might start believing her." Jennifer's concern was valid. Elena had always been skilled at managing narratives, and given enough time and distance from the events, she might succeed in rewriting history. People had short memories when it came to scandals, especially when the alternative version was more comfortable to believe. But I wasn't worried about Elena's reputation rehabilitation efforts. The evidence I had compiled was too comprehensive, too well documented to be dismissed as the fabrications of a bitter ex-husband. More importantly, the professional consequences Elena and David had faced were based on their own actions, not on any lies I had told about them. Let her try, I told Jennifer. The truth has a way of staying true, regardless of how many times someone tries to revise it. What I didn't tell Jennifer was that I had already anticipated Elena's eventual attempt to reclaim her narrative. During the weeks I had spent building my case against her and David, I had been careful to preserve every piece of evidence in multiple formats and locations. The photos were stored with metadata intact, the emails were archived with full headers, and the financial records were backed up with bank authentication codes. If Elena wanted to claim that the evidence against her had been fabricated, she would have to explain how I had managed to hack into bank databases, doctor cell phone tower records, and manipulate GPS data from multiple sources. The scope of the conspiracy she would need to propose was so vast and technically complex that it would require resources and expertise far beyond what any individual could reasonably possess. More importantly, Elena's own digital footprint contradicted her revised timeline. The social media posts she had made during her affair, the location tags from her photos, the timestamps on her online purchases, all of it created an independent record that supported my version of events. Elena could claim that I had stalked her, but she couldn't explain away her own documented presence at the same locations where David's credit cards were being used. The months following Elena's departure had been transformative for me in ways I hadn't expected. Initially, I had thrown myself into work as a way of avoiding the emptiness of my house and the reality of my failed marriage. But gradually, that focus had evolved into something more purposeful and satisfying. My success rate on fraud cases had improved dramatically, partly because I was working longer hours, but mostly because my recent personal experience with deception had sharpened my instincts for detecting lies. I could spot the subtle inconsistencies in financial records that indicated embezzlement, recognize the patterns of behavior that suggested insurance fraud, and identify the documentary gaps that revealed elaborate schemes to hide assets or income. My colleagues began requesting my assistance on their most complex cases that required the kind of methodical analysis and pattern recognition that had become second nature to me. Within 6 months I had been promoted to senior investigator with a specialty in high-value corporate fraud cases. The irony wasn't lost on me that Elena's betrayal had inadvertently advanced my career. Her deception had forced me to develop skills and insights that made me more effective at my job, turning personal pain into professional advantage. I was earning more money than ever before, working on cases that challenged and engaged me, and building a reputation as someone who could uncover the truth no matter how deeply it was buried. My personal life had undergone a similar transformation. Without Elena's constant need for social validation and expensive entertainment, I had rediscovered interests and activities that I had abandoned during our marriage. I started hiking again, exploring trails throughout the Cascades that I had forgotten existed. I took up photography, not the surveillance kind I had used to document Elena's affair, but artistic landscape photography that required patience and solitude. I began reading again, not just the professional journals and case studies that were relevant to my work, but novels and biographies and books about subjects that had nothing to do with fraud or deception. I cooked elaborate meals for myself on weekends, experimenting with cuisines and techniques that Elena had never shown interest in trying. Most importantly, I learned to enjoy my own company in a way that I hadn't since college. The house that had felt empty and hollow immediately after Elena's departure gradually became a sanctuary, a place where I could pursue my interests without having to negotiate or compromise with someone else's preferences. I installed a home gym in the basement, complete with weights and cardio equipment that I used religiously every morning before work. I converted Elena's former office into a darkroom for developing film photography, a hobby that connected me to the methodical, detail-oriented aspects of my personality that Elena had found boring. The garden that Elena had started but never maintained became my weekend project. I learned about soil composition and seasonal planting, creating a landscape that bloomed in carefully planned succession from early spring through late fall. The physical work was meditative, providing a counterbalance to the mental intensity of my professional responsibilities. Friends and family had expected me to be devastated by Elena's betrayal, and initially, I had been. But as the months passed and I built a life that was entirely my own, I realized that Elena's departure had freed me from a relationship that had been constraining me in ways I hadn't fully recognized. Elena had always needed to be the center of attention, the one who planned activities and made decisions about how we spent our time and money. I had accommodated her need for control because I loved her, but I had gradually given up pieces of myself in the process. Now living alone, I was rediscovering aspects of my personality that had been dormant for years. The house itself reflected this transformation, where Elena had favored dramatic colors and expensive furniture that looked impressive but wasn't particularly comfortable. I chose warm earth tones and practical pieces that invited relaxation. Where she had filled every surface with decorative objects that required constant maintenance, I created clean, uncluttered spaces that felt calm and organized. The photography I had taken during my surveillance of Elena and David had sparked an interest in the technical and artistic aspects of the medium. I enrolled in weekend workshops on landscape photography, learning about composition and lighting from professionals who had spent decades perfecting their craft. My instructor, a weathered man named Robert who had been photographing the Pacific Northwest for 30 years, noticed my natural aptitude for the patience and precision that great photography required. "You have the eye for it," Robert told me after reviewing a series of sunrise shots I had taken from Hurricane Ridge. "But more than that, you have the discipline. Most people want instant results, but the best photographs come from waiting for exactly the right moment." Robert's observation resonated with me on multiple levels. The skills that made me effective as a fraud investigator, patience, attention to detail, the ability to recognize patterns and inconsistencies, were the same qualities that contributed to compelling photography. Both required the willingness to invest time and effort without guaranteed immediate rewards. I began taking photography trips on weekends, driving to remote locations throughout Washington and Oregon to capture landscapes during the optimal lighting conditions that occurred just after sunrise and just before sunset. These expeditions provided a sense of purpose and adventure that had been missing from my life during the final years of my marriage to Elena. The physical demands of hiking to remote locations with heavy camera equipment improved my fitness and endurance. The mental challenge of composing shots and timing exposures engaged the analytical side of my personality in a way that was creative rather than purely professional. The solitude of early morning shoots in wilderness areas gave me time to think and process emotions without the distractions of daily life. After a year of this routine, I had developed a portfolio of landscape photographs that Robert encouraged me to exhibit. A local gallery in Pioneer Square agreed to display a selection of my work in a group show featuring amateur photographers, and to my surprise, several pieces sold to collectors who appreciated the technical quality and emotional depth of the images. Photography became more than just a hobby. It evolved into a second career that provided both creative fulfillment and additional income. I began accepting commission work for tourism boards and outdoor equipment companies, assignments that took me to spectacular locations throughout the region while paying me to do something I would have done for free. The confidence I gained from this unexpected success in a completely different field carried over into other aspects of my life. I started dating again, initially reluctantly, but eventually with genuine enthusiasm as I met women who shared my interests in outdoor activities and creative pursuits. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist I met during a photography workshop on whale migration patterns, became a regular companion on my weekend expeditions. Unlike Elena, who had always needed constant entertainment and validation, Sarah was content to spend hours in silence, observing natural phenomena, and waiting for the perfect shot or the ideal research opportunity. "You're different from most men I've dated," Sarah told me during a camping trip to Olympic National Park. "You actually listen when people talk, and you don't feel the need to fill every silence with conversation." Sarah's observation made me realize how much I had changed since my marriage to Elena ended. The man who had accommodated Elena's need for constant stimulation and social interaction had been replaced by someone who valued depth over breadth, quality over quantity, substance over style. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, without the dramatic intensity that had characterized my courtship with Elena. Sarah and I shared interests and values that created a foundation for genuine compatibility, rather than the superficial attraction that had initially drawn me to Elena's charismatic personality. When Sarah eventually moved into my house, 18 months after we started dating, the transition felt organic rather than forced. She brought her own furniture and belongings, but she didn't try to completely redecorate or impose her aesthetic preferences on spaces I had carefully crafted to reflect my own tastes and needs. "I love what you've done with this place," Sarah said as she arranged her books on the shelves in what had once been Elena's office. "It feels like a real home, not like a magazine spread." The contrast with Elena couldn't have been more stark. Where Elena had always been planning the next upgrade or renovation, Sarah appreciated the house as it was. Where Elena had seen our home as a stage for entertaining and impressing visitors, Sarah valued it as a private retreat from the demands of professional life. 2 years after Elena's departure, I received an email from her that was forwarded through my attorney. Elena and David had divorced after less than 18 months of marriage, their relationship apparently unable to survive the professional and financial pressures that had resulted from their affair becoming public. Elena had moved back to Seattle and was working as a freelance marketing consultant, taking whatever projects she could find while trying to rebuild her reputation in the industry. David had remained in Portland, where he was working for someone else's startup rather than running his own company. In her email, Elena asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss closure and her desire to make amends for the way our marriage had ended. She claimed to have gained perspective on her actions and wanted to apologize for the pain she had caused me. I showed the email to Sarah, who read it with the same careful attention she brought to analyzing research data. "She's fishing," Sarah said after a long moment. "She wants to know if you're still angry, if you might be willing to help her rehabilitate her reputation, or if there's any chance you'd be interested in rekindling something." Sarah's assessment aligned with my own intuition. Elena's request for closure was probably motivated by practical considerations rather than genuine remorse. She needed references for potential clients, and a meeting with her ex-husband that ended amicably could be leveraged into evidence that she wasn't the vindictive person some people believed her to be. I declined Elena's invitation politely but firmly, explaining through my attorney that I had moved on with my life and felt no need for further contact. The chapter of my life that had included Elena was closed, and I had no interest in reopening it for her convenience. The finality of that decision felt liberating rather than bitter. Elena had chosen to prioritize her desire for David over her commitment to our marriage, and she had paid the consequences for that choice. I had chosen to build a new life rather than remain trapped in resentment and anger, and I had been rewarded with relationships and experiences that were more fulfilling than anything I had shared with Elena. 3 years after Elena's affair came to light, I was promoted to department head at Pacific Trust Bank, overseeing a team of fraud investigators who handled the most complex and sensitive cases in the region. My success rate remained the highest in the department, and my methods were being taught to new investigators as best practices for thorough case development. Sarah and I were engaged, planning a small ceremony in the mountains that would reflect our shared love of nature and privacy. The contrast with the elaborate wedding Elena and I had planned was intentional, a celebration that prioritized meaning over spectacle, substance over style. On quiet evenings when Sarah was working late at the Marine Research Station and I was alone in the house, I sometimes reflected on the chain of events that had led me to this point. Elena's betrayal had been painful, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities that I might never have discovered if our marriage had continued on its comfortable but ultimately unfulfilling trajectory. The skills I had developed while investigating Elena's affair had advanced my career beyond what I had thought possible. The interests I had rediscovered after her departure had led to creative outlets and personal relationships that enriched my life in ways that my marriage never had. The confidence I had gained from successfully navigating a major life crisis had prepared me to take risks and pursue opportunities that I would have avoided when I was trying to maintain Elena's version of domestic stability. Elena had wanted to trade our marriage for what she thought would be a more exciting life with David. Instead, she had exchanged professional success and social standing for a brief romance that ultimately failed under the weight of its own deception. She had gambled everything on the assumption that her happiness with David would compensate for the loss of everything else, and she had lost. I had chosen to build something new rather than trying to preserve something that was already broken, and that choice had led to a life that was more satisfying and authentic than the one I had shared with Elena. The ending wasn't what either of us had planned, but it was the ending we had both earned through our choices, and looking back now, I wouldn't change anything about how events unfolded. Elena's betrayal had been the catalyst for positive changes that might never have occurred if she had remained faithful but dissatisfied. Her deception had taught me to trust my instincts and value honesty above comfort. Her departure had freed me to become the person I was meant to be, rather than the person she needed me to be. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices while building something better from the ruins they leave behind. Elena chose deception and lost everything she valued. I chose truth and gained a life worth living. The last I heard, Elena was still in Seattle, still working freelance projects, still trying to rebuild what she had destroyed for a love affair that lasted less than 2 years. David was still in Portland, still working for other people's companies, still dealing with the professional consequences of putting romance ahead of ethics. As for me, I was exactly where I belonged, in a house that felt like home, with a woman who valued honesty over excitement, building a future based on shared values rather than shared illusions. Elena had taught me what I didn't want. Sarah had shown me what I did. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.